I'm giving a perspective from England. It is a partial perspective. I could talk for a lot of hours, so I've focused on a couple of key things, and also it's partial because it's just my perspective, and there are lots of other people in the room from England who might have picked on completely different things to talk about. And really they relate to constructions of narrative and the implications of that for community development. So I'm going to just say a little bit about the imposition of austerity and austerity measures in England and what that's meant for the community development field, and the kind of changing and the challenging narratives around community development amongst practitioners in particular. Okay, so people have already talked about this a bit, but we've had huge public service cuts over the last 8 years or so, and that has had a significant impact on lots of people and their quality of community life. So we've had cuts to welfare benefits, people being sanctioned and not having any money for quite long periods of time. We've had cuts in public and mental health services, as well as clinical services. We've had cuts to housing budgets, social care, massive cuts there. So right across the board, people are feeling the impact of those reductions in services. And so people working at community level, I don't particularly do a lot of work at community level now, but people working talk about how it's difficult to motivate people and to get people involved in activity because they're just dealing with the grind of everyday life, really. Whether that's the fact they've got to have 3 jobs in order to make enough money, whether it's that they just haven't got the kind of mental health to participate in something because their heads are taken up with all the struggles that they're dealing with, etc. At the same time, we've had huge cuts in the infrastructure support services that supported community-based organisations. So at a national level, all the kind of organisations that for many years we took for granted, really, and we had quite a lot of national infrastructure bodies, they've pretty much all gone. In fact, they have really all gone. And where they've been replaced by mainly kind of charitable trusts who are running programmes. So they don't have a generic support function in the same way as they used to. And at a local level, we've also had community development stripped out. Local authorities have stopped paying for community development. There's a little bit left that's funded through public health. There are some voluntary organisations, but there's a lot less workers on the ground to work with communities. So that's a kind of a setting of the context as I see it partly in terms of what that means for community development. On the other hand, there is some fantastic work going on, and as a kind of a researcher, we see all sorts of just amazing, fantastic work and amazing people active in their communities. And some of that has come about because the state has withdrawn from almost prescribing what community development should be and what it should look like. So we have got, some people see it as a really refreshing state of affairs, despite the fact that obviously we're not supportive of the cuts. But it's true that we had quite a lot of years, particularly under the last Labour government, where there was a lot of funding going into neighbourhoods and communities, but it was quite prescribed. So you could participate, but it would be in a prescribed space. So you could come and, I think, Niamh, did you talk about participation versus consultation? And a bit like that. So you could get involved in discussing things about your area if it related to the agenda that's been set by the regeneration programme or the neighbourhood renewal programme of the day and the time. So in some ways we've got a freedom and we've got more things happening. And some of the programmes that are running now, the benefits of those are that they tend to be quite light touch. So communities, residents are encouraged to lead, I'll come back to this, but to lead the programmes, lead the projects in their areas. They can access different kinds of facilitation support. Sometimes they can access networking opportunities. Sometimes they can access pots of money, etc., etc. And so there is a kind of burgeoning of lots of small-scale community activity. And I think it's important to hang on to that. I don't think it's the only thing, and there's not as much investment as we'd like. But current programmes I'm involved in, which include the Community Organisers programmes, the Big Local programme, People's Health Trust, all work on this premise of residents should be in the lead, residents should determine the agenda, and we should find ways to support them. So that's the kind of policy context. The other thing, though, that's happened is the narrative around resident-led and lived experience, and I think they're quite problematic. So all programmes meant to be resident-led, and as part of the Big Local programme, Angus and I have just produced a paper on what resident-led change looks like on the ground from our research. But there's this notion that resident-led is a good thing and the only thing. And the lived experience is the same. So now more and more they say, oh, we only want people with lived experience. Well, we all have lived experience. So lived experience of what and in what way? And of course your lived experience isn't just about whether you happen to be poor at this point in time or you have a disability or whatever. It's in a whole context. So it becomes a little bit meaningless. And interestingly, a recent tender went out from the National Lottery for some research into lived experience projects, and they only wanted people with lived experience to apply to be the researchers. But it didn't say lived experience around what. And then I heard that you got all these companies who deliver research putting themselves forward and kind of making up their lived experience so that it could be seen as authentic enough to apply for the money. And it also, the other thing about lived experience and resident-led is it kind of dismisses the idea that people need other resources, that they can do it all on their own, and they can't. And they need financial resources, they need meeting spaces, they need all of that kind of stuff. But also they need access to people to help facilitate discussion and debate and thinking about power and doing power analyses with them and all the rest of it. So I think these terms are problematic for a number of reasons. I've talked about kind of how there was a lot of prescribed community spaces under the Labour government, and there were also we had a lot of regeneration programmes that employed, so in inverted commas, community development workers or development workers, and they were really kind of agents of the state. They were there with an agenda from a top-down programme, and there was a bit of a backlash to that, not just in terms of government and government policy, but also in terms of the NGO sector. And around 2011, there were lots, government wouldn't talk about community development. You couldn't mention community development, they just dismissed it. But equally, so did some of the NGOs, the national NGOs. Marilyn and I have worked with the Community Organisers programme, or programmes, since 2011. And we were a bit stumped at first, weren't we? We couldn't kind of get, they just say, oh, community development, it's all rubbish, that's not what we're interested in, we're interested in community organising. And we'd say, but, isn't it part of the same spectrum? Isn't it? Oh, no, this is completely different, and it's new. Well, clearly it wasn't new. It was what some of us who've been around a long time think we were doing in maybe the 70s and 80s, but it was new to this generation of people. But they were just dismissing community development out of hand and not discussing it, not having a debate about it. So the challenge in one way is a good one, because we should be challenging, but equally we have to have discussion about what it means and why another particular terminology means that this way of working is better or different or whatever. So we've had that kind of construction of a narrative around community organising too, which is partly what yesterday was about as well. And my concern around that is that we're losing lessons that have been learned in the past, that people won't discuss things, they won't learn, and we just start on another thing. And it's as though it's all brand new. Somebody yesterday afternoon in the plenary said, they thought they'd invented the term social action. Well, that organisation the person was talking about has only been around for about 3 years. So, it's good that people are talking about social action, but there isn't any sense of kind of knowledge or history or learning from the past, and I think that's fine. the other thing about community organising, of course, is there is a lot of community organising going on, and not all for the good. So we also have to be aware that the community organising that's going on in lots of northern communities where I live is about Brexit, it's about the BNP, it's about racism. It's very successful community organising. And then on the other hand, we've got community organising in the programmes that I work on, but also in Hope Not Hate, the anti-racist organisation, and various others that are positive forces. So we've got, when we talk about community organising, it's not one thing, and it's for a whole variety of different purposes. Arguably, in terms of Brexit and the right and all the rest of it, it's been quite successful. And we need to really reflect on that, I think. So just finally, and I had a heading, Reasons to be Cheerful. I think you finished with that, Niamh, as well, didn't you? Whilst it can be really difficult for people to get their voices heard, there is some wonderful stuff happening, whatever you want to call it. We witness communities doing some amazing things, whether that's in response to the cuts and austerity, like opening their own social supermarket, and I saw lots of people last week who got involved in that, or whether it's the Pit Stop Diner in an old mining town that's now bringing people together for meals, right through to young people getting involved in drama and new opportunities through that. There's a whole variety of stuff that's going on. We also have quite a bit of direct action starting to come through again, so particularly through ACORN, community organising model from the States, the union-based organising. So there's been lots of campaigns around private landlords and the banks, and some of that's been quite successful. We have organisation workshops running in different parts of the country, so inspired by Santos Dumore, and that kind of capacitation and systematic way of organising. So there's some fantastic stuff happening in spite of everything else, and some of that is funded by the government. I'd just like to see a lot more of that kind of stuff and more funding like it, really. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.